as they come in. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. We will be recording today's session because inevitably there are people that signed up and can't make it or need to listen to it later. So we will be recording it, just so that you all know. We're also going to be sending out an evaluation link directly after the webinar closes today. And through that link, you can also request a certificate of attendance if that's something that you would like. And next week, we'll be sending out a link to the recorded version of today's webinar. And I want to say a really strong special thanks to all of you for making the time today. We are keenly aware of how stretched you are right now. It's kind of a crazy time, and everybody is using every ounce of creativity and commitment and strength that they have to provide the services and take care of our own lives during this time of the pandemic. Today's session is part of a special COVID-19 series that we've been doing. It's particularly tailored to some of the questions we've been getting from homelessness and housing program providers. So case managers and other staff who are hearing about a lot more domestic violence among the folks that they're working with. We've got the wonderful Linda Olson, who's just a longtime esteemed colleague of mine and of many of us with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, who will be our primary presenter today. We also have the intrepid Jill Robertson from Collaborative Solutions as one of the folks who's going to be watching the chat, sometimes answering questions and bringing information forward. So please use the chat to ask your questions and make comments that you'd like to make. It helps us know what more you need to know, and we can also direct those questions back to Linda once the presentation part has finished. We're going to be taking questions at the end after probably about an hour of presentation, and we hope that you've got lots to interact with us about on this topic. Okay, next slide, please, Jenny. I don't know if Linda wants to pipe in on this or
sure.
if you want me to do it.
I'd be happy to. This is Linda. And I'll introduce myself a little bit more in a few slides, but I'm with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and WSCDV is the leading voice to end domestic violence in Washington State. And we really work at doing visionary work as well as engaging the public, all as we support our members and work through them and together with them to hopefully end, decrease domestic and sexual violence. Next slide.
Okay. Thank you, Linda. Okay, and NASH, I mentioned that I'm with the National Alliance for Safe Housing. This is Chris again. We are a national technical assistance provider. We've been around for close to 5 years now, working collaboratively with other TA providers, and we'll learn who those are in just a second. And our mission is really to work with communities who are working at the intersection of domestic and sexual violence and housing and homelessness and housing instability. So really trying to help communities find the resources and tools and develop systems that will provide more access to survivors to housing options. And we want to be part of creating a world where safe housing is a right that's shared by everyone. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, we're part of a collaborative partnership with both federal agencies, and you can see them listed here. That's a broad federal collaboration that is kind of unprecedented. So we're very proud to be birthed by that, that interaction and collaborative work among those agencies. And there are 6 of us as technical assistance providers that have been brought together by our federal partners to try to fill as many knowledge and resource gaps as possible around the country. One of the things we find ourselves doing a whole lot is lifting up the voices of people out in the field who are figuring things out. And that's a lot of what our webinar and peer support sessions have been about, that we've been doing for a few weeks now since COVID has come upon us. So there are all our partners. Thanks, Jenny. Okay, let's start talking about today. Some of the things that we're going to be trying to cover today, and we'll try to have as many answers to your questions as we do, but we'll also, as I said, know what we need to follow up on if there's information that we can't provide you today or information you'd like more special sessions on. So today we're going to be talking about domestic violence in the current context in the world that we're all living in right now during the pandemic. In order to create a great foundation for you all in responding to domestic violence that is popping up in your housing units these days, we're going to talk about how to recognize and respond to domestic violence in your programs. We're going to be talking about the concept of safety planning and looking at safety versus safer. You'll learn a whole lot more about what we mean by that as Linda gets going with her slides. We'll talk some about how to have the conversation, and we're really anxious to hear from you in addition to the ideas that we may have to offer about modifications to that you're making during the pandemic. And then we're also going to talk about the importance of and the how-to around working with domestic violence advocates and agencies, because that partnership is incredibly important. Next slide, please. So as many of us know, just because it's on our news feeds on a pretty regular basis these days, there are lots of indications that domestic violence is increasing in the context of stay-at-home orders. And I understand that the same phenomenon was occurring during other crises that we have faced during the Great Recession, during Hurricane Sandy, just as one example, and I'm sure Katrina and the other hurricanes as well, and similar stressful periods. I think one of the things that's happening is not only the stress of the crisis, but in this particular crisis during the pandemic, the stay-at-home orders are causing survivors to shelter in place with their abusers during a time where the tendency to use power and control combined with the increased stressors and the increased opportunity, access to the survivor or the victim in the household, and then reduced options, many survivors not knowing who to call or if some of the resources that are typically available are available right now, fears around accessing them, going to a shelter during a time of pandemic and fears of infection and all kinds of things. So what this is all amounting to is an equation that results in elevated danger for survivors. And let's go to the next slide, please. All right, before Linda gets started, we just want to kind of take your pulse and ask you to answer these poll questions. And we're asking you to respond to the question: during the pandemic, staff interacting with families we're housing have noticed. The first option is more situations where DV seems to be or definitely is a factor. Fewer survivors wanting to separate from the person causing harm. No change. Hard to know. Interaction is difficult and infrequent right now. So if you could go ahead and click on the answer that's most resonant for you at this point. And Jenny, I'm actually not sure if people can vote for more than one, but if that's possible, vote for all that are true. I'll just take a moment while people are thinking about that. Okay, so people can only vote for one answer. I'm sorry about that because there might be multiple answers that fit for you. So if you can pick the one that is most true for your situation right now. Okay, and Jenny, can we see the results of the poll? That's interesting. The most frequent answer is that it's hard to know what's going on with the families we're housing because interaction is difficult and infrequent. The second most chosen answer is that there are more situations. There seem to be more situations where DV seems to be or is a factor. Some of you are noticing that fewer survivors are wanting to separate from the person causing harm, maybe because of some of the barriers like those I mentioned. And just a few of you see no change. Okay, thank you. All right. Well, now that we've kind of gotten a sense of what you're experiencing out there, I'm going to turn it over to Linda Olson, who's going to take us through some of the things that she's found have been effective in working with homeless systems and homeless and housing providers when it comes to responding to domestic violence. Linda?
Thanks, Chris. So this is Linda, and I am just so happy that so many of you are joining us this morning for this particular webinar. This is a passion of mine. I've been doing domestic violence work now for about 34 years in all assorted ways with shelter, transitional housing, mostly housing in general, and trying to test pilot different ways that survivors can best access housing, best be served by housing interventions. And I've had the joy over those 34 years of working with a lot of housing homeless providers along the way, and have just so grown in respect for the amazing work that you all do. A part of this presentation really honors the fact that while domestic violence providers certainly are focused on supporting victims of domestic violence, victim survivors, the housing homeless world is looking at ending homelessness. And that's homelessness for everybody. And so as you negotiate sometimes the challenging path of working with people in different phases of a relationship that may often be abusive, I just have to say that my respect is so incredibly in place for the work that you've done. Most recently, I've been working on Housing First for domestic violence survivors the past 10 years. So I believe that housing is a right for everyone and that we should not be making conditions upon people as far as when they might, quote unquote, be ready for housing. And of course, that adds often additional sorts of challenges for all of us as we're working together to keep people safely housed. The presentation, just a little bit more about that, stems from work that our coalition has done with providers that work with entire members of a family. So my coworkers, Lee Hoffheimer and Eileen Stoll, many years ago, got together with Jill Davies and picked up many of her approaches to acknowledging the presence of abusers in the lives of survivors and realizing, again, survivor-driven services, we need to honor where survivors might be in terms of how their relationship is going to continue or end. So the core of this presentation started with Lee and Eileen doing work with home visitors, Parents as Teachers program, home health clinic workers, and doulas, So we've got a variety of folks who go into people's homes. And I've adapted this for housing homeless providers, knowing that I continue to learn and have learned over the past couple of years from all of the wonderful people in Washington State and in Seattle, King County, who provide everything from permanent supportive housing to chronic homeless folks to those who are doing family housing and everything in between. All right, so now, Ginny, we're ready to move on in terms of the backdrop. Before we get too much farther into the presentation, it's always important, and we're hearing so much more about this now with COVID too, that the disparity with homelessness and people of color, particularly African Americans and Native Americans, is high. And is painfully high for all of us, and we need to hold that close. It's the same thing now. COVID-19 is highlighting that in a way that if homelessness didn't for people, the death rates and some of the deep structural racism that continues through our communities are all factors that we need to carry close in our hearts as we provide services and are open and welcoming to people. And as we do our community education, structural racism is deep, and for us to talk about this in a way that is respectful in many ways, but also encourages people to recognize the racism with which we often view people who are not just homeless or victims of domestic violence, but what communities they might be from. And finally, LGBT youth are disproportionately likely to remain homeless due to overt discrimination. We know that there are high numbers of youth who are homeless because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, and that tends to linger once they become homeless in the first place. Okay, next. So the basic dynamics, which many of you are probably already familiar with, I've certainly found that in the housing homeless folks that I have presented this to, is just what domestic violence is. What we really hold out there as the primary source and roots of domestic violence is just that coercive control, the power and control. Many of you have probably seen those power and control wheels, but it is that pattern of coercive power and control that's used by one person over another person. And it's much more than physical or sexual abuse. There are more behaviors that definitely contribute to how can somebody control another individual. And ultimately, if the person resists whatever sorts of coercive control behaviors is happening, there are often consequences or harm that then is experienced by the individual. So this means that a survivor's autonomy and safety are influenced by their experience and knowledge of that person causing harm. It is not just that one point in time, perhaps, of domestic violence, but it is also the ongoing experience that somebody has realized in terms of their partnership. A survivor's planning and the choices they make anticipate that abusive person's reaction and the potential actions, which is something to keep in mind as we might be working with couples or with individuals who are looking at relationships or including relationships in their lives that might be abusive, that their past, what they've experienced in general, but also with this person, really frames and directs how they are going to make their plans and to act. One of the key things also, and this is so hard now, especially with COVID, but even in a perfect world, somewhat perfect world, a survivor's community becomes smaller. Partners who cause harm, one of their chief ways of causing harm and having that go unnoticed by the larger world is to isolate a survivor from their network of support. And that undermines their options. And losing that autonomy, losing the support, because we all need our support networks, is one of the most harmful pieces of domestic violence and the power and control. And again, something for us all to keep in mind as we try to reach in with survivors in general, with or without an abusive partner in their life, but certainly with, is just how isolated they were to begin with, and how much that will probably continue and be worse with the stay-at-home orders we're operating under. Next. So these are just 9 things to know about DVSA, and I won't spend a lot of time on these slides. They are the highlights that my coworkers have found really useful as they work with home visitors and with doulas, is just no matter what, remember that coercion and abuse is about power and control. Key thing to keep in mind. It's intentional. It isn't just that spontaneous outburst. It is really thoughtful. It is intended to keep somebody in control of another individual. And even as we look at the interrelationships between 2 people, it might be difficult to figure out who's causing harm and who is the target of harm. And we'll revisit that in a future slide. But the fundamental harm of abuse is a loss of autonomy, of agency, of that sense of I have control over who I am and over what my decisions might be. Next. Key to remember, number 1, survivors are the experts. We can stand on the outside, we can have all sorts of opinions about what they should be doing, and our opinions might be totally be right, often coming from a very kind, loving, wonderful place. But ultimately, we don't know the whole story of any survivor. And we have to recognize that they are the experts. They're making their judgment calls. Their judgment calls might not always be the best ones, really, when you look at it, but ultimately they are the experts in their life. And it's important to work with them, stand back and listen to them as they let us know what is the best route. Next. Something else that I've really been noticing in this particular highlight with COVID, abusers only use the amount of force that's necessary. There might have been a history, like we've mentioned before, of threats, perhaps of physical violence. It is a touchstone. It's a point that abusers can always return to, hint at, in terms of reminding somebody that there could be consequences if someone acts out, reaches out, tries to gain support from other people. They use just the amount needed to gain compliance in the relationship. And what I've noticed in newspaper articles, at least here in Seattle, is that while DV agencies are not getting as many calls as they have, most likely because of having an abusive partner right there in the home with them, police calls have increased by about 21% for domestic violence. However, there's been a dismissive factor in those police calls where what the responding officers and what kind of the press has been saying based on their information is that none of these are criminal acts. There's been no crime committed. It's just 2 people having a spat or having difficulties in their relationship. And of course, it breaks my heart thinking we still need to do some more training related to this dynamic. Anytime we question that survivor story, anytime we dismiss that frantic call to a police department that they don't dare make to a DV agency, but really are looking for help, for protection, for support. And when it's dismissed, it gives the abusive person even more power than they had originally. Okay, next. Past abuse matters. It impacts the current decision-making of the survivor. We've mentioned that. Next. Sexual violence within an intimate partner, domestic violent relationship is common. And sometimes forced sex may be the only kind of abuse someone experiences. And they might not be able to tell you that or willing to tell you that when you're trying to find out more about the experiences they might have had. It's shameful, it's embarrassing. And we need to remember that, that they're not always going to disclose and often won't disclose those deeply personal points of their life. So let's move on. Another thing I've already alluded to is not telling is not the same as lying. We often see where people don't always disclose everything to everybody. It might be slivers here and there. Sometimes there might be also the not always remembering the impacts of trauma as far as their conversation and the story that they might be recounting. And of course, the question always is what is the benefit of telling you? Why would they share all of these intimate details about abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and some of the other forms of abuse with a perfect stranger? And this is a comment that I often think of those of you who might be doing the screening for coordinated entry and trying to look at those vulnerability tools as you ask people questions about just what sorts of things they need in order to access housing. Next. Something we all have to remember, survivors have been surviving before we met them. They will continue to survive after they leave us. And we just need to have faith in them and not carry the whole world on our shoulders. So many DV advocates programs are so worried that someone will die because of a move or something that we've done wrong. And we have to remember that it is in the abuser's power to pursue whatever they might be pursuing with that victim. And we have no control over that particular individual's choices as much as we might be helping a partner. Move on. The best way to support children is to support parents. We build resilience by supporting the parent and child together. For those of you who have family programs and there are children with a parent, they're linked. And while we all know that parents can have many, many challenges, I know I certainly did with my two as they were growing up, we appreciate that sort of support that recognizes the desires to love, create safe spaces for our children, and that sometimes we might misstep along the way, but ultimately making sure that you support a parent so that their children can have that reliable adult in their life and experience the love from everybody. Move on. And finally, and this might be one of the most important, well, all 9 things are important, but we have to remember leaving doesn't always equal safety. We know, and this is one of those historical data nuggets that have varied over the years, but it's been very clear that the danger levels for a survivor increase when they choose to separate or leave a relationship. If we look at news clips, we can see from some of those news stories when there's been a homicide that the person had left or was trying to leave. And the remembrance, the recollection that even as we start pushing and saying, well, why don't they just leave? There could be some really valid reasons related to safety in terms of timing, of negotiation. And again, it's important to listen to that survivor. Okay, next. So this is one of those slides that, of course, is more relevant in a world pre-COVID. I'm not sure what will happen if we ever get after COVID, but these are tips when you are actually meeting together with somebody, the face-to-face. And it's so difficult when you try and do that remotely. We will have a slide later that gives you the links in terms of tech safety, what to do in terms of talking to people remotely. But when you're looking at someone who potentially might be coming in with an abusive partner, or perhaps they're not seeking housing with an abusive partner, but that individual is lurking in the background, it's so hard to ask some of these questions. We talk about the connection, rapport, fostering trust. And our standard practice, again, in a pre-COVID world, is to interview people separately. I've often heard along the way that that's not something that is routinely done for some of those screening assessments for coordinated entry, that people are interviewed together as a couple, as a family. And we would always encourage you to try and do that individual interview first, even though it takes a little bit more time, and to make it standard so that people aren't suspicious. People realize that you genuinely want to know about each individual in this relationship, as far as what housing might work best for them, what sorts of supportive services available with the housing could be supportive of the family, of the relationship, and of the individuals in particular. However you are doing this, be mindful. Always pay attention to safety dynamics. Always pay attention to culture and language. It's been frequently pointed out to me that as I talk about safety dynamics and might potentially identify if somebody's doing all the talking, if there is a sense that power and control might be at play in this relationship, that there are red flags here. And of course, there are people from a wide variety of communities that really serve to remind us that in many cultures, certainly in many religious practices, that there is a head of the household, that there is someone who is recognized as being the spokesperson for the family, and to try and negotiate, again, the safety dynamics and trying to see if you can talk to people individually while respecting culture and the communities they're from. If you can get them individually, each of them, it's great to ask if they've been physically hurt by someone. And don't just ask if you are a victim of domestic violence, but just really talk about different examples of being physically hurt. If there's someone they're afraid of, it might not be the person they're coming in with if they're coming in with a partner. So really exploring what the domestic violence might have been in their life and if they are in fear right now. And if it sounds like there has been domestic violence, do ask if they would like to speak to a DV advocate. Certainly by now, and we'll talk more about those relationships, it's important to build the relationship with your local DV program and have that sense of communication back and forth, and be able to offer up the resources if somebody might potentially be interested. Next. We all need on both sides, whether it's DV providers or whether it's the housing homeless folks, no matter who you are, is understanding the survivor's contact with the person who has abused them, the person causing harm. We've shifted our language from abuser or batterer very intentionally. While there are many survivors that appreciate that language, there are also many who consider that person, again, human, a again, they have history with them. Again, perhaps there is a community tie. So trying to think about person first language and thinking about someone who causes harm has been a way that we've reframed it at WSCATIV. And understanding the contact. Even if we really feel that it is dysfunctional and hurtful and harmful, there are a couple of reasons or a couple of areas of reasons. And that first column is the survivor may have no choice. They might be tied to that individual because of the children and mandated visitation. That individual might be the primary child care source. The individual might be the source of transportation, access to money. We often see survivors who have disabilities or have health care needs, and they rely on the person who is causing them harm for their assistance and aid. Often there's uncertain legal status. It is not uncommon for someone who is causing harm, for an abusive partner, to hang that over someone's head if they are an immigrant, whether they are here with all of the documents necessary or not. There is the miscommunication intentional that would imply that they could be sent back to their country at the whim of the abusive person. And also the fear of facing homelessness. Especially right now in COVID, I would emphasize that. What on earth would they do now? It's bad enough becoming homeless just in the world as it was. But right now, in terms of the fear and the anxiety related to this virus, someone is much more apt, as we've been hearing, to stay in that relationship because there isn't any place to go. We have to also honor the other column, that a survivor wants contact. Survivors go into relationships. We all go into relationships thinking highly of someone, usually being in love, having romanticized versions of love or feelings about that. And we hope for change. We want to go back to whatever the experience was when we first got together with that person. Many survivors want the relationship. So many of us, again, we thrive with connection. We want to have that intimate partner who loves us and cares for us. A bullet farther down talks about emotional support. And sometimes that's been offered along the way. It might not be reliable, but the desire to have that. I've heard many survivors talk about the individual in question, the person causing harm, as they are the parent of our children, and I want them to parent. The children need that parent, and sometimes that outweighs whatever abuse the children might have seen in the home or what the victim might have sustained. Healthcare disability needs. Again, they might trust this individual because they're the ones that they have turned to and rely on for their health care. And, the person has a home and the survivor doesn't want to leave that home or feels that they would not have a right to having that home if they chose to separate. Next. This is a question that I have heard so much along the way from many of you who are housing homeless providers. There have been stretches where that is, when I ask about burning questions at the beginning of a presentation, it's the first thing that comes up, is what about when both people, when it's mutually abusive? And how can we tell who is the person causing harm? And in this world where you can't really rely on gender or a list of behaviors, we need to think more about the context, the intent, and the effect to see who is establishing power and control over the other person. And this takes some discernment. Sometimes it can be challenging when you see what people might be doing within a relationship to each other. and you only see that one sliver, that one moment of time. But being able to step back and try and think of a pattern and the context. Who faces consequences or retaliation for resisting? You know, what ultimately is the effect on the individual who is receiving the abuse? What is the intent of somebody who is being abusive? Where do you see the potential for that power and control? And as you sort through that, and I'm going to throw a resource out here, we have a pretty extensive training partner, TA partner with the Northwest Network of Bi, Trans, Lesbian, and Gay Survivors of Abuse. They are located here in Seattle, and they do a 2-day training specifically related to this. So if there are more in-depth questions or desires to explore this more, they are a great resource. And I think in the midst of all of this, going back to housing homeless providers and what it is your mission is, ending homelessness, for the couple, it is important to explore other strategies besides eviction. I've heard from providers who basically say, we don't know. There's so much violence here in this relationship that we're just going to evict both of them. And I would just encourage people to rethink that and try and figure out a way that that separation can happen, so that both people are safe, and that you don't have to make a final call on who's the victim, who's the primary perpetrator, and still be able to house both. Okay, next. So this slide speaks to listening differently. And that, of course, is coming into a conversation with an open mind, with a desire to connect, with a reflection of what the individual is telling you. I think so many times we all get caught up in moving through a number of people we have to talk to, in looking at the quantities of people who need help. And all of that is important to think about. But it is so vital in the moment with each person you talk to listen. Listen differently, no preconceived notions, and to build bridges. Ask a survivor what they need and what they want. And if the person causing harm that you can get a sense of is present with the survivor, and in this world, so hard to tell, and I will look forward to our chat after these slides to hear ideas from you all of what you've been doing. But trying to be careful not to have any sort of decision-making or safety-related conversations with a couple when you are sensing that there is any remote possibility for coercion, control, abuse. And consider why a survivor may use violence. This is something that DV programs know, and it can be a little challenging at times in general. But for everybody, survivors may use violence in self-defense. They may use violence to protect their children. And so many survivors may use violence or abusive tactics in order to regain control over their life. I think we all know, and I certainly am one that doesn't take kindly to someone telling me what to do, controlling me. And I'm not always the most pleasant person when I'm reacting to that individual who is trying to do that to me. And so I think it's important to recall for survivors who in particular might have a history of trauma and really need their autonomy, are really asking for that respect. And get pushed to a point where they want their control back, no matter what. It's their own form of self-defense, but it's about their life and their agency. Again, help bridge the relationship between the survivor and the DV program. That's what DV advocates are there for. This is what we all do the best, is being able to sort through these dynamics with a survivor, no matter what place they're in. Next. Confidentiality, honor it. There are many, many trainings out there about confidentiality, but the primary reason that DV programs, DV advocates are so focused on this, and we have been historically, sometimes to the irritation of our housing homeless partners and HMIS, but survivors need to have control over their information. It is a key to their autonomy and to their safety. And again, we go to that point of, why should they trust you when they know that they are partnered often with people who track? Why should they trust us in giving us all of that personal information when they don't know where it's going or how it might be used? So confidentiality, honor it. There are many legal protections in place, many trainings out there, many provided by NASH. So by all means, access that. Look for potential breaches of confidentiality in your program. Sometimes we get a little casual about gabbing about people. You know, we don't necessarily think, especially those of us who might be with larger agencies that have access to a lot of data, we don't necessarily realize that there might be those who are abusive within our organization. There might be people who know people, and that especially when we think about smaller communities, this can really be a big impact if you don't have just a tight, firm policy about confidentiality within your program. And when in doubt, ask the survivor, who do they want you to share their information with, under what circumstances, and for how long? Next. So the safety versus safer, and this is, of course, Jill Davies' language. Jill is an attorney. She is from the Hartford, Connecticut, and I have the organization under my nose a minute ago, but don't right now. But she is definitely there on the web, on the internet, a fantastic resource. And in her history of working with survivors, she is seeing that it's not the absolute of you have to be safe and we are going to make sure that you are safe. Oftentimes we have to start with safer. And that really might just be a start with. It might not be the end game, but it is a way to get in the door, to really think about measures that somebody can utilize while they are still either living with or closely connected with. Oh, I see it. Jill Davies is with the Greater Hartford Legal Aid. I happen to see that chat. So thank you. Perfect. Maybe it will get implanted in my brain one of these days. So anyway, next slide. So thinking about the safety versus safer, the goal, of course, is to be safer. We ultimately would like complete safety. We would like that left-hand column. But just looking at the two in comparison, the safety, no violence, don't we just wish that for everyone? But might it have to be less violence? Might we work with a survivor around reduced levels, less frequent, less control? Perhaps, as we'll see later in this presentation, when there is that opportunity, because we're serving the entire family, to speak to that person causing harm about some of these things. It might be a toe in the door, might not. It really depends, again, on the relationship and the context. But ultimately, we would hope that somebody is safer and that what we can do with that survivor would promote that. We all want people to have basic human needs met. But if we, in our world, in the right-hand column, can help increase economic stability, Just having that increase, being able to meet basic needs and provide more financial resources, what we are doing, whether we are domestic violence advocates or whether we are housing homeless case managers, we are increasing choices and options for that survivor. As their economic stability and the potential for that is increased, there is a world that opens up that really does provide more of a choice. Social and emotional well-being, this is the same thing. Again, we all wish that for every survivor, but just being able to strengthen that well-being, thinking about that as an intermediate goal, where there's more resilience to the effects of violence, emotional healing, increased social support, that is so critical. And of course, reinforcing somebody's cultural strengths. Our support as advocates and as case managers in doing that well-being strengthening with somebody, supporting them there, again, opens a world of choices, of real options between economic stability and well-being strengthened. We can look at there being less and less violence and hopefully, perhaps, a complete break from violence. Next. As we start thinking about safety planning, we need to think about not just the abuser-generated risks, but also life-generated risks, and realize as we move into that safety planning part with survivors that they are weighing both of these things. On the left-hand side, we can look at what is life with this person like? How violent, how abusive, how diminishing, what is it? Are there good parts? Is that one of the things that you would be weighing? And then the other side of this is, so what is life like in the neighborhood? What is life like without that individual? Is there a preference there? Is somebody weighing this in a way that they need to think about for themselves and potentially for their children? What is it like for their children in this relationship? But on the other hand, could a survivor make ends meet? Could they support their kids? Would they have access to health care insurance? Who handles the money? Would they have access to that? Could they do that on their own? Would they be penniless, trying to beg for money? Would they be trying to look at TANF, some of the other resources that they would hope to have? Those are all unknowns, and it could be very scary. Do they have access to transportation? Do they have access to a car? What is transportation like for them otherwise? Are they already good with transit? Although we've unfortunately found in our rural sections of the state that transit can be pretty dangerous. It might very well be in urban areas, but we hear that abusers can certainly find out or certainly know somebody's habits, and with not too much transportation in terms of options, abusers will actually wait at bus stops. They will scope out where somebody might be, and it's the only way somebody can get from one point to another point. For that survivor, is it easier just staying? Is it easier just not having to have that as an unknown danger? Is there a lease? Is there a house? Is a survivor's name on it? What would it take to get that name? Again, there are many protections under VAWA. That is a great resource still with NASH, but survivors might not know that. And this is an important partnership with your DV organization to find out or to help them sort that through. Is there safe, affordable housing available? That is, again, if they don't have access to a home, if they're not able to stay in their home, what else is out there? How easy would it be to access? And we know that that's hard. We know that there isn't a lot of affordable housing available, especially right now. So it is daunting, again, in terms of, do I stay? Do I go? Does that abuser know how to use the systems against a survivor? And they certainly will, whether it's the immigration system, whether it's the legal system. In DV world, we all know how often survivors get dragged through courts for one thing or another, from custody to property battles to heaven only knows what else, so that it's exhausting. And survivors get to a point, and I've heard from so many myself, it's just easier to stay. I can't do this any longer. And finally, is that abuser potentially a source for drugs? Many survivors might have used drugs, turned to drugs and alcohol to cope, to numb, to make it through the traumas they've experienced in their lives. And this person might be the source, or the only source that they really know of for drugs. And then finally, what are the supports in a community? When somebody is looking at what they know, it might be easier to stay with the evils and the pain that they know than it is to venture out into a community that they've been isolated from and that they don't know. Next. For those of you who have families, who have kids in your units, it is always great to think about just this little continuum of how to make kids safer. And looking at the time, I realize that I've been talking way too much, so I will pick up the pace here a little bit. But we want to make sure ultimately that the parent survivor is safer and supported, and that the parent doing harm is, in a perfect world, less harmful and more helpful. So that kids can have that sense of resilience in their homes. Next. Safety planning is not a product. Please do not put together a safety plan with all the check boxes and call it good. It is a process. It is constantly moving. I am going to defer to the links here, NASH's Safety Planning Toolkit and NNEDV's Tech Safety site. Those are critical resources for you to integrate into the work that you do with survivors and DV agencies. Next. In terms of your program helping with safer planning, get to know your DV partners. If you don't already, make sure that that is a place for conversation. I might not suggest coffee out right now during COVID, but when you have an opportunity, if you don't always already have a good relationship, really look at developing that. And the same thing with the DV agency folks. I know that sometimes there have been tensions with housing homeless providers because we come at things from a safety aspect versus an ending homelessness aspect. But we need each other, and we definitely need those relationships. I'm going to drop down to the help the person causing harm with resources if they become homeless due to exclusion from the unit. It doesn't help anybody to have someone who has been abusive to be homeless under a bridge somewhere. It usually makes it worse for a survivor if they are able to identify where that person might be. So keeping in mind that, that housing resources for someone causing harm is every bit as important for the survivor as it is for them, is always that, you know, we need to make sure that we can try to do that. Next. Yeah. So let's move on to the next slide. This, again, these are just the references to a wide variety of information. The links are out there, the information is out there, great trainings are out there through NASH and NNEDV. So next. And probably a real quick couple of minutes with working with DV advocates and agencies. I am going to assume, hopefully, and it's accurate, that many of you already are in close partnerships, which is so helpful for survivors. Next. For those of you who don't have that opportunity or haven't had the opportunity of really getting to know advocates and what it is an advocate does, we're not case managers, though we certainly can be. We have many of those skills, but this is all about providing advocacy that accompanies, transports, supports, build bridges to the communities. It is that person walking alongside of in the community and present for that survivor as they wish to have that individual present. Navigating complicated systems for and with a survivor, this is so important, especially when we're looking at welfare systems, at court systems, at complicated systems for anybody, but to have an advocate who is familiar enough with the systems that they can walk with a survivor can really make a difference. I have a couple of favorite advocates that I love working with because they speak to this in a way where they will start out doing something for somebody potentially with the level of trauma that a survivor might be experiencing. The next time around, they will do it with them. And then the third time, the survivor is on their own with that knowledge that the advocate is there to come back to or to reach out to. But for many, and this particular advocate works with a culturally specific organization for immigrants and refugees, and her knowledge of some of the challenges that people who are new to this country might be facing gives her that sense of how can this be helpful for them to navigate some really difficult systems in general, but also just some of the simple day-to-day things that many of us take for granted. Next. Our services are voluntary, so my tip to the housing homeless world is please don't tell people that they have to come to us for services in order to be housed. We wouldn't be too fond of that, and that wouldn't be a happy way to strengthen a relationship. And we look at voluntary services as the housing homeless world does when you think of housing first and the knowledge that in order for people to really make changes in their lives, they're the ones who have to decide whether or not to do that, and forcing them never really helps. So I think remembering that that's the way we are, and we are that way because of VAWA, because of our funding sources, because we know that that is the best way for survivors to negotiate a world and to make choices about what they think is best for them. And they will do it according to their own timing and not somebody else's opinions or impositions. Next. This is about making a supported referral. Always encourage somebody when you can see, when you can hear, in whatever way you can hear, for them to access a DV program. Again, we encourage that access happening directly from the individual so that we know that the relationship is voluntary on their part. You can certainly offer to facilitate making a connection, and always check in with the survivor about their experience. You might want to advocate for the survivor when needed. I will say that DV agencies are overwhelmed. We are far over capacity, often turning many people away, and there's a lot of data out there on just how much advocates are trying to negotiate, especially now. So it might be difficult in order to support somebody that you're working with in your housing program to that level of connecting with a DV agency. Don't give up, be proactive, and of course support that survivor in every way possible in their choice to access a DV agency, or if they choose not to, as some might. Next. Working together, you will be getting these slides, and again, the information is out there, but really educate yourself about DVSA. I know many of you already have. Get acquainted with your agency, and of course understand confidentiality. hold closely those ROIs, the release of information, because survivors really deserve to have the decision about whom you're talking to. And they need to be able to revoke a signed ROI at any time if they're feeling uneasy about having signed it in the first place. So build those relationships with the DV programs. Reach out today. Next. And I was thinking that that was indeed the last slide. So I guess now is chat box time and questions, conversation. If you've got hints.
Yes. Hey, thanks, Linda. And there haven't been a whole lot of questions in the chat box, so you must be doing really well answering them as you go through your presentation. But I do have a couple that came out that I wanted to circle back to. You were talking earlier, way early in the presentation, about how one of the indicators that we're having that DV is up right now is maybe not through, in some communities, increased calls to hotlines and programs, but increased calls to the police. And in mentioning that, you said that some of those calls or visits that the police might be making, or the calls themselves, are just kind of being dismissed. And you mentioned that sometimes that may have the impact of giving the abuser more power. Can you describe or explain a little bit what you meant by that? How does the abuser gain more power if the police dismiss the call?
The abuser has usually told a survivor in the history of the relationship that no one will believe them or respond to them, that it is pointless reaching out because perhaps the survivor, is crazy. So there is that underlying information of reaching out being not useful. So when that reach out does happen, and if there is an article in the newspaper where the police are quoted as saying as well, it really, there was no crime committed, it was just, you know, a little altercation, people are cooped up together. That's the kind of thing that even if an abuser is not reading that in the newspaper, but it is that attitude, that response in the call that, again, diminishes somebody's desire, need to have someone intervene, reaching out in some way, only to basically hear, and I can't necessarily fault police when they do a call and there has not been an assault, there has not been the domestic violence committed. So it's challenging, but ultimately the fact that when somebody is dismissed, it affirms what the abuser just told them or has been telling them. Nobody will listen to you, nobody will believe you. It's pointless making that call.
Mm-hmm.
Did that help?
Okay, thanks, Linda. Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you. What can you share a few thoughts about what victims can be doing these days during COVID? If there's a sense out there that the typical resources may not be available to them, what would you like providers and survivors to know about those options and resources right now during COVID?
You know, right now, and I'm sure Chris and you all can add to this, there's a lot of information coming out regularly from NNEDV. There's a lot of local information. We're inventing this as we go and trying to identify safe ways where survivors could reach out is a huge challenge. So I'm sorry I don't have a better, more complete, articulate answer, because it changes, it seems like, every day. And how survivors manage to reach out, to find that quiet, private place to make a phone call. I know that DV programs, when they get that sort of call, are most likely quick to respond depending upon where they are and how overwhelmed they are. But it's challenging, you know. And Chris, you might have more thoughts too.
Well, yeah, I've definitely heard that survivors have indicated that it's easier for them to respond through texting than it is through a phone call. So some DV programs that haven't typically relied on texting very much as a tool for staying in touch with survivors have begun really embracing that. It's easier to text a quick message than it is to try to arrange, you know, being out of earshot with somebody who's in the same housing as you. That's one thing that I've heard. I've also heard that programs are devising quick ways to say in the very beginning of the call, this is how you can signal to me that this is not a good time right now. So by saying, if this doesn't feel like a safe time to have a call, just tell me that there's nobody here by that name, or tell me that you're not interested, or something like that, so that you can then portray, the survivor can then portray the call to the abuser, if it's overheard, as some unsolicited sales call, that kind of thing. So that there are ways to find out, is this a safe time or not, that people are kind of coming up with. And, you know, I think the tech safety stuff that you talked about, the link to the NNEDV tech safety website is a great one for people to look at for just tips about how to use technology safely. But I'm also curious if there's anybody in the webinar who can type into the chat some of the ways that they're finding to stay in touch and stay connected to survivors in a safe way. That would be great to have you add that to the chat, if you would. So we'll wait for anybody who can add to that part of the conversation. And in the meantime, I'll ask you, Linda, someone asked how DV providers can engage with local housing providers. What are some of the ways you've seen programs doing that successfully?
Well, the way I've always done it is to go and visit them. The work that I've done, I've usually been a part of that homeless planning committee or coalition that might be in the area, be involved in homelessness in general, so that there is that opportunity to meet folks, to visit their programs, and vice versa. It cements relationships. And I've still got relationships with people in the housing homeless world that have lasted over 30 years, simply because of being with them and caring about homelessness in general. And the partnership goes both ways. It takes time, but you can get some great friendships out of it too.
Yeah, and better cross understanding about that intersection. Jill Robertson from Collaborative Solutions also typed into the chat box that joining the work of your local continuum of care is another way to really cement those relationships and make sure that the two systems are working more collaboratively. So that's another avenue to take. See, we've had a couple of people say that they have been looking at how they can text, sneak in a quick phone call, as one person said, just to try to time it in some of the ways that we've talked about. Let's see, sending newsletters and, that's newsletters and information for clients through the mail, so that people are still maintaining contact with folks through the good old snail mail route during this time that it's more difficult to go and see people in person. Lauren has just shared that they've had difficulties contacting clients through the phone for various reasons. So during the COVID pandemic, they have set up, sent up-to-date information as well as other things, such as protecting their children from online predators, while tech use increases while social distancing. So trying to just get information through to the household, probably as a way to not only provide valuable information, but just kind of send that message, I'm here, we're still here, we're out there. And that's a good reminder to folks who are not being able to maybe have visits or face-to-face contact right now. Okay. Okay. Oh, one other question in a early slide, Linda, and not to put you on the spot if this is out of context for you now, but you were talking about being aware in an early slide of safety dynamics. And someone asked if you could give an example of what you mean by safety dynamics.
Yeah, and this is where, for me, the in-person is so important. It's hard when you've got, you know, if you're trying to do something remotely, but just the in-person interactions. You know, I often think of the church pew story where a couple would come to church every Sunday and the abusive partner would basically have his arm around her, but he was pinching her arm the entire time. And it was just kind of his way of controlling what it was that was happening with her. So you know, I think it is just that sensitivity to the dynamic between two people and having the presence of mind to be mindful about that. Does that make sense? Chris, maybe you can add to it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just little clues that you might see sometimes from nonverbal behavior or the way that people interact with one another. I could imagine that somebody who jumps in and finishes somebody's sentences or talks over that other person is exhibiting maybe impatience, but maybe it's a form of control and kind of monitoring what their partner has the right to say in a conversation. So those are some examples, I think, of those safety dynamics that just give you little hints about what might be going on in the relationship.
Yeah, and just, you know, certainly being aware of that and then also putting that into a cultural context too.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes it could be contextualized that way, and sometimes that's why we just try to observe.
Right.
Yeah.
Observe, be mindful. This is not the time to be thinking about your next question or how you need to respond to something. It's that space to just really connect and listen.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think the chat box has gone kind of quiet. So unless anybody has any additional questions they want to throw up there really quickly, we can just close a little bit early. Okay. All right. Well, I guess we've gotten to the questions. You certainly have a chance to ask more questions in the follow-up emails that you'll be getting. You'll have a way to request technical assistance or more information. You'll be getting the slides and the recording will be available next week. And you can see in the chat box right now, there's a link to the evaluation for today's webinar. I want to thank you, Linda, so much for sharing your time and your expertise. And I think it's really notable that this presentation has been put together based on lots of interaction that you've had around the state with different housing providers and housing systems people, that it has spoken to them in a way that has made sense for their program operations, and as you said, their obligations to serve the household, in addition to keeping safety in the foreground. So thank you very much, and thank everybody who attended today for taking the time out. I hope you take something away from this webinar, and we appreciate you coming. Take care and stay safe out there. Thanks for all the good work that you're doing.